All right, guys, we are here to do another bit of reading. I'm still house sitting, just at a different place. So, different view for you guys to see. Just trying to get my camera angle set right and get situated here. We're picking up on chapter 14 of Leave No Trace. My mother gave me a necklace once. She called me into her room one day and held it up in the sunlight filtering through the bedroom window. A simple string with a slice of superior agate for a pendant. The striations of white and burnt orange looked like a depth map, sharp at the edges and polished in the middle. The light caught its brilliance and made it flash into the corners of the room. Lake and lighthouse together. I asked her where she'd gotten it, but she didn't seem to hear the question. She traced the layers with a finger, describing the billion-year-old volcanic eruptions that had tried to tear North America apart. But they didn't. The eruptions ended in tiny bubbles in the lava filled with mineral sediments. Scout, what are you doing? We shouldn't do that, because then you mess things up. Don't lick my keyboard. Okay. But they didn't. The eruptions ended in tiny bubbles in the lava filled with mineral sediments. The white is quartz and the red, oxidized iron, which is the same thing as rust. Have you ever imagined rust looking like this, Maya? I shook my head. At 10 years old, I hadn't given rust much thought. This is what the earth makes, she said, laying the necklace carefully back in her jewelry box, out of violence and decay. Do you see? I didn't know what she wanted me to see. I saw a semi-precious stone, no different than the minerals in our rock garden, or the 4-pound agate she'd found in college and kept uncut on her bedside table, her prized specimen. Our house was littered with rocks as paperweights, doorstops, and decorations. I saw their form and function, nothing more. So it's sedimentary, I offered, but it was the wrong thing to say. She shut the drawer and turned inward, telling me to go play until dinner, which we both knew she wasn't going to make. I didn't see the necklace again until a few months later, when she took the copper study job on the iron range, packed her things, and left before I got home from school. The 4-pound agate was gone from her bedside table, and the pendant necklace was lying on my pillow. I didn't think about it in those first few days of her bewildering absence, when every sound in an empty room brought me running, stupidly expecting to see the rich tumble of her hair, her thin frame turning to me and restoring what she'd fractured. It wasn't until after Dad read me her letter and we started to accept she wasn't coming back that I remember the afternoon she showed it to me. Had I failed some obscure geology test? Was there a hidden meaning in the agate? Something that might have made her say, stay if I said the right thing, been the right daughter? I had no one to ask, and the questions only grew louder with every milestone she missed. Every day without her in it, the questions became my brothers and sisters. They were with me always, in my blood, until 5 years later, when I found an answer that sent me to the depths of Congdon Psychiatric Facility. I must have dreamed about the agate necklace because it shimmered in the shadows of my mind as I lay in bed, unwilling to get up from it another late night studying Boundary Waters topographical maps and the restless non-sleep that followed. The necklace itself was gone, and I didn't really want to think about where, so instead I rolled over and saw Jasper lying patiently in my bedroom doorway, waiting for me. You want to take a drive today, Jas? He answered by walking over to the bed, laying his head on the sheets and licking my elbow. I sighed. No kisses. Time to put your game face on. Today was a huge day. Today, Lucas took his first sanctioned step toward the Boundary Waters. My plan was simple. If Lucas could prove himself capable of behaving in public, i.e., not running off or assaulting anyone, then Dr. Mita had agreed he might be able to join a search party to locate his father. I'd stepped up I'd set up different field trips every day, with progressive liberties attached to each outing. First, we started by taking a walk around Congdon's neighborhood and worked up to our last test at the end of the week, a drive up to the shore up the shore to Split Rock Lighthouse with Dr. Mita in tow. I showered, gulped down a quick breakfast, and drove Jasper up the hill to Congdon, where at least 15 Free Lucas Blackthorne protesters waved signs and took footage with their phones. Lucas's escape attempts from Congdon and St. Mary's had given fuel to both sides of the fire raging on the social media sites. To those who believed he was a dangerous criminal, it proved his unbalanced state of mind. For the protesters, whose presence outside the gate seemed to grow every day, his actions were a desperate plea for help, and the Congdon staff had become the instruments of his oppression. This morning, the redhead girl, who'd led the charge on the police motorcade the night we brought Lucas back, took several halting steps toward my car as I pulled up to the guardhouse, talking and gesturing at me. I kept the window rolled up and flashed my badge at the guard, who quickly opened the gate and waved me through. Pulling up to the drop-off zone at the main entrance, I saw Bryce already waiting with Lucas out front to meet us. They dressed him in street clothes for our outing, or at least a mental health facility's version of street clothes. He wore a bright turquoise hoodie, sweatpants, and a baby blue stocking cap with cat ears, courtesy of Dr. Mita's wife, who bought cat caps for all the patients and never knew most of them ended up ripped to pieces or shoved into snowbanks within a few days of their annual arrival. At least the hat sort of matched his arm sling. Jasper rumbled a hello as we climbed out of the car, and I let him sniff Bryce's shoes, while Bryce looked less than comfortable. Is that the same dog that chewed on this guy's foot? I don't know. I nodded to the holster on his belt. Is that the same taser you tried to kill us with? Lucas's eyes widened, and he stepped back, pulling against the grip Bryce had on his good arm. Bryce bristled, but before he could retaliate, Jasper's muscles started wandering up his leg. I was doing my job, he said. Now call off your fucking dog. Fucking, Lucas muttered. Why do people always say that? I could escorted everyone back to the car. It's an expression, an all-purpose word for people who don't know very many. Fuck you, Maya. Bryce jerked open the car door. See? Adjective, verb. It can be a noun too, like isn't Bryce such a dumb fuck? Bryce cursed some more and threatened to call Dr. Mita while I engaged the child locks and waved the two of them into the back seat. Jasper climbed in front next to me and immediately turned around to inspect Lucas, who was glancing between his sling and the hand Bryce was using to grip his taser handle. Don't get bent out of shape, Bryce. It was just an example. I handed back a blanket to cover the dog, covered in dog hair. Here, put this on him. Bryce made Lucas double over and covered him with the blanket as we pulled out of the parking lot. The protesters parted as the gate opened, hovering only a few feet away from the car. They were near enough to see the blanket, and I held my breath as we pulled through them, not too fast, not too slow, only exhaling when we got halfway down the block. Bryce uncovered our patient, and we drove for a few minutes in silence. Free Lucas Blackthorne. What? I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's what those signs said the other night. That's who those people are. Lucas looked behind us, but Congdon was already out of sight. They want you to let me go. Sighing, I tried to explain the situation, the controversial celebrity he'd become, but the more I said, the more agitated both passengers became. Jasper whined and tried to pace, hitting me in the face with his tail, rubbing his head nervously against the seats. I steered the car over the cracked and potholed pavement, climbing higher up the hill until we reached the Enger trailhead. Look, it's complicated. I checked the parking lot to make sure it was empty before pulling into a spot. These people don't understand the legal system or the mental health system. Neither do I, Lucas muttered. Jasper and I got out and then let Bryce and Lucas out of the back seat. Bryce immediately lit up a cigarette. All you need to know is that they love you, Bryce puffed. They hate me, they hate Maya, and they love you. All right? Bryce. He rolled his eyes and turned away, scanning the perimeter. I can't even log into Twitter anymore. I'm getting tagged on so many posts. I had to cancel my Facebook account. One of my cousins is out there protesting and texting me every day. Every freaking day. She thinks I'm the reason he got sent to St. Mary's. Bryce, we can talk about this later. We could talk about how I sided with his cousin on that one, but right now, Lucas was absorbing every word, his gaze shifting between the two of us. Yeah, Right. Bryce took another drag. So, what are we doing here? I pointed out the superior hiking trail that led into the woods at the south side of the Twin Ponds. It wound up through the park and toward Anger Tower, the five-story bluestone observation building. And if you try to run or incapacitate Bryce or me in any way during this walk, Jasper is going to have you for lunch. Understand? I said it mostly for Bryce's benefit, but Lucas still shifted uneasily. I understand. Okay then, let's hike. The four of us set off. Enger Park was situated on the peak of the bluff overlooking Superior. Below us to the east, Victorian houses and brick buildings stood in varying degrees of disrepair from the constant punishment of the winds. To the west, the land flattened out into college campuses, strip malls, and suburban housing before giving way to forest and the Iron Range beyond. The temperature on top of the hill was always at least 5 degrees warmer than downtown at the water's edge, sometimes 10. Today, that meant we were flirting with 50 degrees and only traces of the blowing snow from a few days ago swept into the crevices underneath rock ledges and gathered at the base of the evergreens. I led our strange little troop onto the trail and up toward the summit. Jasper led the pack with Lucas and me following, and Bryce bringing up the rear. The path was littered with dread and decaying leaves, and I sensed Lucas looking around, trying to gauge the extent of the forest. He stared at the tower on the hill and seemed surprised when we descended into a parking lot in the middle of the trees. I kept walking, moving away from the cars and the few people milling near the tower, directing us up a set of stone steps to a giant gazebo with pergolas on either side. A slope of exposed rock, anthracite gabbro dotted with scrub brushes, provided a perfect outcrop in front of the gazebo to get a panorama of the largest freshwater harbor in the world. Lucas stared at the horizon of blue. Where's the other side? Dang! Bryce huffed out a laugh and shook his head. It's out there, he shrugged. I've never seen it. Your dad has. I nodded, scanning the blur where clouds met water. He's out there somewhere, too. After examining the drop-off around the outcrop and eyeing Jasper's position, within biting distance of the meaty part of Lucas's leg, Bryce wandered back up to the gazebo and lit another cigarette. I watched him pull out his phone and start texting people, apparently too wrapped up in his unwanted internet connection to worry about our patient escaping. Leading Lucas and Jasper over to a bench, I wrapped my coat around my middle and curled up on the iron slats. After a beat, Lucas sat down next to me. What is it? I asked. He shook his head, refusing to respond, even as he glanced back at the trees again. Don't even think about it. Jasper is much faster than you. He heaved out a sigh and crossed his arms, staring sightlessly at the vista. Why should I tell you what the matter is? The retort, an angry teenager's reply, sent my brain stumbling back. I thought we were beyond this. Keeping my tone casual, I reached down to scratch Jasper behind the ears. Well, I'm glad you asked. This is what we call therapy. The modern form of psychoanalysis was developed ages ago by a guy named Freud, who incidentally could have used some of his own medicine. But informally, the idea of communicating to resolve conflict dates back to I didn't ask for therapy. I asked for your help, he interrupted. All these people outside Condon want me to be free. You said you were going to help me, but here we are in Duluth, not going anywhere. Do you know how frustrating it is when someone you love is suffering and you can't get to them? I swallowed and stared at the fractures in the rock where the weeds kept growing, even with the nightly frost freezing their leaves. They would be back next year and the next, never flourishing, never giving up. Yes, I nodded at the rock. I do know what that's like. That's the problem, he said. I don't know anything about you, do I? I tell you everything and you tell me nothing. Turning to face him, I looked at him straight in the eye, giving him my complete attention. What do you want me to tell you? Why were you a patient at Condon? My mouth fell open in sheer surprise. Lucas watched me, waiting until I exhaled, long and heavy. What does that have to do with anything? It tells me what kind of person I'm trusting with my father's life. Then his head dropped and his jaw tightened, struggling with the qualification. If he's alive. I tried to put myself in his place. tried to remember how it felt before I'd really gotten to know Dr. Nita, the one-sided revelation called counseling. It had been uncomfortable, exposing, like I was stripping naked and prancing around in front of a fully clothed, expressionless people. As Lucas's speech therapist, I wasn't supposed to tell him my life story, but as a friend, there's not much to tell. My mom didn't stick around, he supplied, startling me with his uncanny recall. Yeah, I plowed ahead, trying to do it quick, like a band-aid. I didn't handle it well. Neither did my dad. He disappeared out there. I waved to the lake as much as he could and left me with a woman who didn't care what I did so long as my dad's checks cashed. She lived over there. I pointed to an area even farther south of our house, whose violence, drugs, and drunkenness saturated the neighborhood with a reek even the lake winds couldn't blow away. I started hanging out with random kids on the street, getting into trouble. What kind of trouble? The usual stealing, destruction of property, breaking and entering. I discovered I had a knack for picking locks, which endeared me to a certain group of people. And that's why you got sent to Congdon? No. Bryce stubbed out his second cigarette and headed across the outcrop toward us. I turned to Lucas, my face carefully blank, and told him what I'd never shared with anyone outside of Congdon's walls. I got committed because I killed a man and painted my face with his blood. Lucas gasped as Bryce reached us. I stood up and stretched. Are you done yet? Bryce asked. I patted Jasper on the head. Yeah, let's go. Chapter 15. Something happens to you after you kill a person. I'm not talking about the guilt or the doubt or the nightmares that make you do it over and over. Each time a little different. Each time like you have a chance to change it, but you never can. What happens in the daylight hours is a bubble forms between you and everyone else, invisible and impenetrable. Everyone on the outside is all the same. They work and they hustle and they complain about what they don't have, and then they go home and crawl into their beds and drift away. And you can never be part of them because something is awake in you that doesn't know how to sleep. I still remember the crunch of his skull, how it didn't feel broken as I smashed the rock into it. There was no sudden give, no tremor of anything reverberating through my fingers, but I heard the pop of fracturing bone. It was a dull sound, the kind of noise that would have been forgotten in the next breath if it meant anything else, and it wasn't even the sound itself that haunted me. It was the feeling that washed through me the instant I heard the crack and saw his body go limp. Not horror, not regret, not even relief. It was happiness, a raw, savage joy that flooded my veins as I stood over him. I was 15. I had just ended someone's life, and I was happy. The week started out on a crap note to begin with. Some cheerleader named Hope, why not call her glass half full, you unsubtle helicopter parents, picked a fight with me before class, and of course, I was the one who got suspended, not Pom Pom Girl. Dad was somewhere on Lake Ontario and wouldn't be back until Saturday, so I spent the week roaming Lincoln Park with all the badassery of an unsupervised spring ninth grader. I walked the train tracks, stole Twinkies from the gas station, and finally decided to break into an abandoned warehouse where I ran into two guys smoking weed. Their names were Derek and Rex, and they called themselves D-Rex, or rather, Rex did, and Derek put up with it. I'd seen them around before. They'd just gotten into town and had hung around the fringes of our group for the last month or so. One was short, the other fat. I didn't think I had anything to worry about from some short, fat rookies, even if they were a lot older than me. So we spent the afternoon wandering the neighborhood together. Rex, the fat one, kept wanting to find things to eat. Derek, the short one, played music on his iPhone and scrolled through the crappy pictures on my old flip phone. One of them was a picture of a picture, a shot of me and my mother standing in front of the cabin. When he asked, I shrugged off a few details, touching the agate necklace I wore beneath my shirt. Yes, that was me. My mom used to take me up north every summer before she left. I swear to God, I saw her the other day. Rex and I came from up north. From L? I spun around. Yeah, L. I didn't even register the glance between them at the time. You still have the cabin, right? I didn't think. I reacted. Rex knew how to hotwire cars, so we found a rusted Ford parked in an industrial lot with no surveillance cameras. Before I knew it, we were driving out of town, and it felt right. Even though I'd always thought of the cabin as our place, hers and mine, it made perfect sense that she would have retreated there. The place had been in her family for generations. It belonged to her, and my dad had refused to take me there since she'd walked out. I just assumed he couldn't stand the memories, but maybe they'd made an agreement without telling me. Maybe she'd been living there all along. The sun was setting by the time we arrived, and my heart practically beat its way out of my throat. I had tears in my eyes as I crept up the front walk and felt 10 years old again. I'd taken the agate necklace off and clutched it in my hand for most of the drive. I didn't know what I was going to do. If I'd clasp the pendant around her neck, throw it at her, or break it into 1,000 pieces on the doorstep. The earth took violence and decay and made agates, she said. So maybe I take agates and make violence and decay. There weren't any lights on inside, and I didn't know the security codes, so I went to ring the doorbell, thinking the guys would hang back and let us get our angry reunion on. They dogged me right up to the door, though, and kept asking me the code. Maybe you'll remember, Rex prodded. I'm sure one of your parents told you. I looked from one to the other, and slowly the veil of stupidity lifted. They couldn't quite hide it in their faces, and I knew then that no one was on the other side of the door. They'd never seen my mother in their lives. Wait, I said, feeling a different kind of tremor taking hold. I think they hid a copy of the code in the boathouse with the spare key. The walk took forever. I scanned the horizon with every step while they flanked me the whole way down to the water. Our lot was large and wooded. The nearest neighbor, a recluse named Harry, spent most of his time fishing and probably wasn't even home. There were no boats on the lake when we approached, only a single loon bobbing like a black speck on the sunset orange waves. Our boathouse was a creaky shack on the beach, and I threw open the unlocked door, knowing right where to look. A loose piece of plywood covered not a key, but the gun my mother had always hid out here because this was bear and wolf country. I dug underneath the plywood, scraping against studs and cobwebs, finding nothing. Where was the gun? One of the guys stepped into the doorway behind me, blocking the light that trickled in, and I spun around and kicked him right in the stomach, sending him flying. I ran out of the boathouse, but didn't get 4 steps across the beach before the other one, Rex, tackled me. He flipped me over and said not to scream, that if I told them how to get in the house, they wouldn't hurt me. Derek walked over, bracing his gut and smiling. He wanted to scream. As they grabbed me, I didn't think about why they were doing this or why it was happening to me. Those were questions Dr. Mita gave me later, the kind of questions people had when they believed their lives were worth something. It didn't even occur to me to question them. They were animals being animals. The only refrain playing in my head was that what an easy mark I'd been. Stupid, I kept thinking. So stupid. Rex, the fat one, held me down as Derek tried to take my clothes off. I fought and yelled at him, which was what he'd been waiting for. He'd started hitting me, close-fisted, over and over, until even his friend told him to stop. Leave, then, Derek said. I'll teach her a lesson by myself. Rex stayed for a little longer, nervously checking the horizon before he slunk into the trees. As he left, I heard him tell Derek, "Shut her up, for Christ's sake." In response, Derek flipped me onto my stomach and clamped his hand over my face, cutting off my voice, and that's when I saw it. It was tucked among the other rocks, forming a circle around the lakeside fire pit, the place where we had built bonfires and roasted s'mores and watched the sunset over the water. Heavy, jagged, the exact size of my hand. It didn't belong in that fire pit, and I knew instantly what it was and who had put it there. When I went quiet, Derek released his grip on my face so he could yank my jeans the rest of the way off. Then I grabbed my mother's prized 4-pound agate and smashed it into his temple. His hands flew up, and I kneed him in the groin. When he dropped, I rolled up, and drove the rock into his head again and again until I heard his skull break. There was a gurgling sound. His muscles seized, and then nothing. I stood over the body, cradling the bloody rock in my hands, and cried tears of absolute gratitude. I knew the answer. I understood what my mother had been telling me all those years ago. Agates can only form when something in you is destroyed, when the hollows of grief or depression can never find the light, and the sediment that accumulates inside them is dense. Their power changes you. She had changed into something that wasn't able to be my mother, but she left me a way to survive. As clearly as I knew I was standing on a shore next to a dead man, I also knew she wanted me to find this rock. The pool of blood spreading underneath Derek's face seeped over the sand until the water got at it, pulling it away in streaks of deep red shot with amber. I dipped my fingers into the blood and painted it over my forehead and cheeks in a fortification pattern. Then I walked back to the cabin. Rex was waiting by the car. As soon as he saw me with the rock in hand, mask congealing over my face and murder in my eyes, he jumped in the truck and gunned it out of the driveway. I never saw him again. I kept walking until I got to Harry's cabin and sat in front of his door, waiting for it to open, while new minerals formed deep inside me, filling the hollows with a type of strength she'd never had. I could feel Lucas's shock as I told the story. The wind had picked up as we walked back through the park, whipping the dead leaves into a white noise that made conversation almost impossible. Almost. I spoke in a low, monotone voice as the air slapped me in the face, stinging tears into my eyes and drying them before they could fall. I barely registered the trail ahead of us as I related how Harry had found me and the investigation that followed. The coroner counted over 20 contusions on Derek's skull. They said I wasn't hurt enough to justify murder, especially when there was no evidence of rape. I told them the truth I felt shining and clear in that place, and then had to lie about later so that I could leave Condon behind. I told them my mother spoke to me through rocks, and that she'd given me the agate to kill him. Our group came out of the woods at the trailhead and crossed the Buckingham Creek Bridge toward the parking lot. I could hear Jasper's pants again and the click of his claws on the pavement. Bryce, still bringing up the rear, gave no sign he'd heard any of my story. He ignored me as I glanced back, one thumb in constant motion on his phone. Lucas, though, had caught every word. It was surging in his eyes, lighting them with an underwhelmed understanding. Instead of heading for the car, I steered us toward a floating dock on one side of the twin ponds, and Jasper, eager for the detour, pulled on the leash until we reached the end of the narrow planks. "What are you doing, Maya?" Bryce called from the parking lot. "I'm going to be late for my next patient." 2 minutes. Facing the water, I let out a breath. I've never told that to anyone except Dr. Mita. Lucas squatted down and leaned against the railing, staring at the pond. "Thank you." And then, after picking at the metal for a second, "Why did you think your mother gave you the rock?" It was impossible to explain it. The instant certainty I saw it nestled in the fire ring. I felt the riddle of her life unfolding, the briefest flash of her attention and love before I was abandoned again, left with the mark of the agate and a corpse leaking out its blood. I'd never questioned the sanity of that day, not in the detention facility or in court, or the months at Congdon that followed. But it wasn't a reality I knew how to translate, not even 8 years later. I shrugged. It wasn't something I thought, it's what I knew. He nodded, but he didn't understand. I didn't expect him to. I was about to suggest going back to the car when he surprised me by asking, "Was there much of a skull left after you were done?" I cocked my head, curious. "No." Lucas looked at me for a long moment before standing unsteadily on the swaying dock. "Good." We stood there with the wind pulling at our clothes while Jasper ran up and down the floating walkway, making us struggle for balance. I'd spent my life separated from the rest of the world, first by my mother's illness, then her ghost breathing in every rock around me, and by the dead man whose eyes wouldn't stay shut when I fell asleep. I couldn't get rid of them, and suddenly I was furious that they might keep me from knowing the one person even further disconnected from the world than I was. I didn't want to be unreachable. Not anymore. Not to Lucas. I stepped forward, about to speak, when Bryce's warning cut through the air. In the parking lot, I saw a streak of bright red hair. The girl from the protesters ran toward us, leading a group of cell phone and sign wielding fans. I stepped in front of Lucas, calculating the distance to the car, when Bryce grabbed his taser. Chapter 16. No. Clinching Jasper's leash and holding Lucas behind me by his good elbow, I navigated the narrow dock as it dipped and swayed. Bryce held his arms spread wide, holding the taser and blocking the group from getting to us. The red-haired girl recognized him and, pointing at the weapon, started in on the Eighth Amendment and cruel and unusual punishment. Shouting above her, Bryce swept his arms forward, trying to make a space for us to get off the dock where we were trapped. Phones pointed at us, and I squeezed Lucas's arm. Get ready. I could hear him saying, "They want me free." The hair on the back of Jasper's neck stood entirely on end. He growled and shifted his weight, unsure of what to do. I choked up further on the leash, steadying him until Bryce had pushed the fans back far enough for us to duck through. "Excuse us. Please allow us to pass." I tried to make myself heard as we edged forward. The closer we got to the crowd, the more Lucas stiffened against my grip. His head jerked as someone called his name. A girl young enough that she should have probably been in school, who ran forward and yelled, "I love you." Bryce caught her just as she launched herself at us, holding her by the arms and glaring at me. "Go." "Come on," Jasper barked as I dragged him away, shielding Lucas's face with my free hand. The red-haired ringleader began shouting at Bryce to release the girl while two more of them chased us across the parking lot, holding their phones in front of them like talismans. I unlocked the car, and Lucas got in immediately, bending at the waist and covering his ears. Jasper climbed in front, and ignoring the shouted questions and yells, I asked everyone to please move back so I could pull out of the spot and return our patient to Congdon. They swarmed the car instead, holding their phones to the back seat windows and making it impossible to see where Bryce was. Revving the engine, I inched back, finally spotting Bryce in the center of the crowd. Angrily, he holstered the taser and gestured to the road. "Go." I went. We took the fastest route back to the hospital, with Jasper pacing, falling whenever I turned, and anxiously checking the windows. Lucas stayed hunched over for the entire ride, only sitting back up after we cleared Congdon's gates and were driving through the parking lot. Pulling up to the main entrance, I put the car in park and turned around. "What was that?" He still looked shell-shocked. "One of the reasons it's not entirely safe for you out there." "I don't want this." Without warning, he ripped a sling off his arm and threw it on the floor of the car. "I don't want any of this, Maya." "I know." I reached a hand over the seat. "I'm going to get you there, I promise." He took several deep inhales, using the meditation breathing, and then wrapped my hand in both of his, squeezing down to the bone. The next few days passed in a blur of emails and phone calls, crammed between near constant sessions with Lucas and updates to Dr. Mita. I checked the ice and websites, making sure none of the Boundary Waters lakes were freezing over yet, and also monitored news sites and social media. Other than a bear sighting near Twin Harbors and photos of the last of the fall colors, it was quiet up north. I wished I could say the same for Duluth. Footage of Lucas at Twin Ponds had swept through the media, causing backlash as the protesters and throwing Congdon's practices even further into the spotlight. Dr. Mita had given a news conference explaining patient reintegration privileges and appealing to the public for their support. With Lucas in attendance, I held the first meeting for the search party, who were surprisingly easy to recruit. Everyone wanted to be part of the rescue effort. Winter be damned. 2 orderlies volunteered within 10 minutes of when I sent the email, and Dr. Mita offered up one of the associate psychiatrists as the medical resource on the expedition. A U.S. Forest Service ranger named Micah was going to be our official guide, and within 2 minutes of meeting him, and without asking, I learned that he'd grown up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He needed to find some direction after his discharge from the military, and he had absolutely no problem with crazy people. Officer Miller, who was sitting in on the meeting, stifled a laugh as I shook the ranger's hand. I started by displaying the same picture showcased on all the news outlets and taped up on my fridge. The blackthorns, sitting on a dock together before they disappeared. After repeating the story, everyone in the room knew. I told them the part they didn't know, that the Blackthorns had lived happily off the grid for 10 years until a few months ago when Josiah got sick. It's been 25 days since Lucas last saw his father, and time is running out. Our mission is to rescue him before the ice sets in. I went over the details of the trip. Due to Lucas's inability to pinpoint Josiah's location on a map, we'd backtracked, his journey starting from the outfitter's store. Lucas would lead us to his father, our doctor could administer any emergency medical treatment, and Micah, the forest ranger, would be able to radio in for an airlift to transport Josiah to the hospital. "What if he's already dead?" one of the orderlies asked. That question sparked a debate about whether a helicopter would be called, under increasingly extreme conditions, merely to transport a body, and who was going to pay for all these extraordinary measures. The doctor suggested towing an empty canoe for the remains, but after accidentally catching Lucas's murderous look, quickly amended that it could be used to haul out any extra stuff from their campsite, too. After all, he appealed to everyone else, careful to avoid Lucas's corner of the table. That's the motto in the Boundary Waters, right? Lucas grunted, drawing the table's attention. We don't need lessons on how to disappear. I directed the conversation quickly back to the list of supplies, cautions about entering the Boundary Waters in November, cue smug grins from the ranger, and general preparations for monitoring Lucas, who needed to be supervised at all times by Congdon staff. He would sleep in a tent with the orderlies, paddle with me, and wear an ankle bracelet in the event he got separated from the group. As long as Dr. Mita gave the approval, our target departure date was November 1st, 3 days away. Sometimes when things move forward, they move backward too. It was a strange sensation, a déjà vu carnival ride. I'd spent years trying to forget Minnesota, and now it had clawed its way back into every corner of my life, past and future. A man killed, a man who might be saved. Everything converged in L. There was no hiding from it anymore. So on my last day off before the search party was scheduled to leave, I left Dad a note and drove north. If Duluth was considered small by most urban standards, L was hardly more than a dot on the map. It had been an iron town until the mines gave out, drawing all the miners to the taconite under the towns to the south. Now it was a collection of small businesses, a hub for the Forest Service, and of course, a gateway to the Boundary Waters. Soon after my discharge from Congdon, I'd read that L was named the coolest small town in America, referring to possibly more than the temperature. Driving through the small grid of streets, I saw a mix of old and new, Babe's Bait and Tackle, Steger Mucklucks, and the Northland Market, sitting adjacent to places with vague names like Insula and very specific ones like Gator's Grilled Cheese Emporium. I drove past Pillar Rock, the one place we always stopped when Mom and I came to town. Our tradition, like some people went to the old-fashioned candy store. Bigger than a car, the ancient greenstone could be found nowhere else in the world. But what I remembered most was that she never let me climb on it, never let me lay my head on those inviting, almost fluffy-looking puffs of minerals. In the center of town, I found a large camping store in a clapboard building whose foundation was lined with flowers. Wilting plants, crosses, and wreaths with ribbons that whipped in the wind crowded next to black and white pictures of a lined, laughing woman's face. A hand-painted sign in the corner of the memorial had Monica Anderson's name, with her dates of birth and death. Across the street, a tax office window was crowded with signs. One of them said, "Friends of the Boundary Waters." Another, in large red letters, read, "Remember Monica, keep Blackthorn in jail." I parked outside the camping store and took a deep breath. Inside, there was enough gear to outfit the entire Forest Service. I browsed the all-terrain boots, the tent covers, and varieties of powdered eggs, picking up items here and there and starting a pile on the abandoned counter. I was on my fourth trip back up to the register when a man appeared on the stairs at the back. Moving stiffly, he unfolded a pair of glasses from his shirt pocket and scanned my selection with flat eyes. "Planning a winter trip?" "Yeah." I set a box of fire starters on top. "Going to find Josiah Blackthorn." His head snapped up. I gave him a bland smile. I don't know anything. I didn't say you did, Robert. I'm just here to buy some gear. His throat worked, and he seemed to be weighing the benefit of $1,000 sale against the urge to throw me out of his store. Eventually, he stepped closer and picked up a pair of top-of-the-line boots. These are men's. This size won't fit you. They're not for me. He braced both hands on the counter then and stared at the stack of clothing, gear, and provisions. He might have been anywhere from 50 to 70, with stone gray hair standing up in odd places, and a series of faint red lines zigzagging through one side of his forehead and temple, like the edges of puzzle pieces, if the puzzle had been bleeding. A huge silhouette of a moose against the sunset hung behind the counter, framed in driftwood. There were other touches through the store. Painted paddles mounted near the ceiling, product explanation cards written in an elegant flourish, the undeniable traces of a woman who'd left her mark, even if she hadn't planned on leaving. Take your business elsewhere. He didn't look at me. I moved to the door, but stopped before opening it, glancing through the window from one end of the street to the other. Why didn't he? Excuse me? It was the closest most Minnesotans would come to telling you to fuck off. Ignoring his implication, I looked through the store, filling in the shadows of struggling bodies, the spill of fluids. Why didn't Lucas go somewhere else? Why did he come here, to an outfitter in the middle of town, when there were 3 other stores closer to the edge of the woods? I don't know. He strangled me. See? I moved back to the counter, approaching carefully, lifting my chin to reveal the faint bruise line. He could have killed me, but he didn't. Robert looked at my neck, and his jaw started working. There are 2 kinds of violence, Robert. Violence as an end, and violence as a means. Lucas' violence is a means, and we both know what the end is, don't we? I let the silence drag out. No one came in to interrupt us, the store virtually dead in the off-season. Picking up a premium winter tent, I added it to the pile. Robert heaved out a long sigh and shook his head, then pointed me to a model that cost half as much. That'll give you the same protection with less draft and an easier setup. I smiled and made the switch. After ringing up the sale, Robert flipped a close sign and invited me upstairs for coffee. He showed me pictures of him and Monica at the store's grand opening. It had been their second career, their dream. He wasn't sure what to do with it without her, and could barely bear to look at the flowers laid outside the building. Then, swirling the grounds at the bottom of his cup, he began talking about Josiah Blackthorne. I told the police I didn't know it was him until they started showing their pictures on the news. Josiah came in a few times a year, and he didn't look any different than most people exiting the Boundary Waters. No one would have noticed him in town. You can't throw a rock around here in the summer and not hit a guy wearing a black backpack. He's always said he was stocking up for next year and always paid cash. Rations, lures, clothes, and I only remember him because he cut the tags off everything and packed it up right in the store. He swallowed. That's what I told the police. I set my cup down. I'm not the police. Robert looked out the window where the Keep Blackthorne in Jail sign was posted across the street. I met Josiah Blackthorne when he and his boy moved to town. He bought a second-hand canoe off me and started coming in regularly after that. Not a big conversationalist, always had his son in tow, but we talked paddle and portage routes, fishing spots, all the regular stuff. Then, one day, he came in by himself and something was different. He asked to speak to me privately, and I brought him up here. He was sitting right where you are now, and I noticed. I noticed dirt on his clothes and under his fingernails. It was early in the season. The ground hadn't even thawed yet, and I remember wondering how he could have gotten all that dirt on him. He said he and his son were moving, leaving town, but he wanted to keep buying his camping supplies from me. He gave me a list of items and 2 dates, April 1st and October 1st, and you agreed. He nodded. I knew right away when I looked at the list. Preppers and survivalists are good customers for outfitters. I figured the Blackthorns were going off the grid somewhere, and true to his word, he came in like clockwork twice a year after that, right up until this fall. He didn't show up this October 1st, and I was worried, wondering if I should do something. I'd given him. Robert covered his mouth as if trying to keep the coffee from coming back up. I always gave him my card when he came in, and I told him if he or his son ever needed anything, they knew where to find me. The words trailed off, and a storm of emotion worked over his face, pumping the scars on his temple with fresh blood. Robert sold me Josiah's unclaimed supplies, which I packed into the car along with the rest of the gear. I was fitting the last of the boxes in the trunk when a vintage Chevy drove by, the rasping putt-putt noise unmistakable, and I lifted my head in time to see the driver stop in the middle of a left turn. His hunched frame swiveled in the window, and we stared at each other, neither making a move. Before I could decide on a reaction, an oncoming car honked its horn, and the driver stepped on the gas, pulling onto the side street. Slamming the trunk, I walked straight into the police station a few blocks away. I had the business card Officer Miller had given me along with Josiah's arrest records, but I didn't need to look at it when the desk sergeant asked who I wanted to see. Sergeant Combe, please. It took 15 minutes for the guy to waddle out into the waiting area, and when he spotted me, his eyebrows shot up to underlie the furrows in his forehead. Waving me back, we went to a messy office littered with empty vending machine wrappers and enough stacks of paper to, to suggest he thought the computer age was a giant hoax. I unfolded a piece of paper from my backpack and sat it on top of one of the stacks. Heather Price's creased face smiled up at both of us. When he saw it, he gave a shocked laugh and leaned so far back in his chair the hinges shrieked. Then he crossed his arms and looked at me up and down, as if checking for weapons. The last time he'd done that, he'd had to take a bloody agate out of my hand, so he probably assumed anything was possible when it came to me. Heard you ended up at a mental hospital. How'd that work out? I shrugged. I'm still kind of there. Better there than here, especially when you seem to have a thing for dead bodies. He grunted and nodded at the picture. Officer Miller, huh? I was wondering about that request when it came through. I got down to it, giving Sergeant Combe a slightly different pitch than what had worked with Robert Anderson. Instead of victim solidarity, I went for the unsolved case angle, but I barely outlined the situation before he was in stitches. You're his shrink? He couldn't stop laughing, and in all honesty, the man had a point. I'm trying to figure out what drove them into the Boundary Waters in the first place. After wiping his eyes with a napkin, he wadded it up and overhanded it into the wastebasket. Never thought they stuck around. Frankly, I was shocked as shit when your boy turned up here. Back when those two went missing, I assumed they hightailed it to Canada. Why Canada then? What were they running from? He nodded the paper. You already filled in your own blank. The medical examiner's report said she died of a heroin overdose. He rifled through a drawer and pulled out a few packets of Cheetos, offering one to me. I happily dug in as he took me through the finer points of the autopsy with a mouthful of orange mush. Heather's body had shown evidence of chronic heroin use, including scar tissue on her veins, abscesses on her lungs, and even tissue death in her heart. Her heart was dying? I scooped up the last of the Cheetos crumbs. That doesn't sound like Josiah's fault. No, he licked his fingers, but listen to this. The heroin hadn't actually killed Heather, not by itself. The medical examiner also found a contusion on her brain. Somehow, she'd received a blow to the head before she died, and the pain inhibitors in the drug prevented her from getting help before a blood clot formed. So she fell and hit her head, I asked. Maybe, or something or someone hit her. Someone with a history of violence. I carefully folded the empty Cheetos bag and laid it on the desk. Why did you close the case? Why was it ruled an overdose? He tossed his own bag and wiped his fingers on another napkin. Believe you me, I searched that scene for any evidence of wrongful death. We couldn't come up with anything, and according to the ME, the drugs and the contusion were kind of a chicken and egg thing. We found her dealer, and he confirmed she bought and shot alone. So my chief closed the case. I picked up Heather's picture. What do you think happened? Why? You know something about it? His voice changed. It became threaded with that universal flint edge handed out to every cop along with their gun and badge. My pulse reacted, but I smiled as I deliberately folded the paper and slipped it back into my backpack. Back then, I was still learning how to pick locks in Lincoln Park. He shook his head. Well, it's probably good you ended up where you did, and lucky for Josiah Blackthorne, he ended up wherever he did. Why do you say that? His lips thinned out. Cops are pretty fair psychologists, too. I don't know exactly what happened to Heather Price, but I do know Josiah Blackthorne was hiding something. The Cheetos had sucked all the moisture out of my mouth. Clearing my throat, I thanked Sergeant Combe for his time and got up to go, but he stopped me, making me wait while he left his office. To do what? Get a tape recorder? Another officer? I wasn't at liberty to reveal anything Lucas had told me, but maybe he could see it in my eyes. A body, Heather Price's body, draped over Josiah's shoulder. I checked my phone and thought about leaving before he could come back, but as I moved toward the door, he appeared again, handing me a box that looked like it held files. I set it on the desk, lifting the lid. That came up for disposal a while ago. I'm not sure why I had them keep it. Reaching in, I pulled out a plastic bag holding the Aggie, my mother's Aggie, still crusted with remnants of dried blood. It felt lighter than I remembered, the colors less vivid, but still warm to the touch. I've never given anyone back a murder weapon before. Don't worry. I dried my eyes and put the bag in my backpack next to the picture of Heather Price. I won't tell anyone. And that is where we're going to stop for today. I will pick up reading again and get these loaded up on YouTube. As always, like my YouTube channel, share it with anyone who's interested in listening, and drop comments. I will reply to them. Catch you next time.